and stimulating discussion, to learn from the expertise and the experiences of our panelists, and to learn from your expertise and knowledge and experience as well, across sectors and across disciplines. So our session today is focused on what we've learned from COVID-19 for rapid evidence synthesis. How do we balance speed with rigor and generating a robust evidence base? How do we talk about complex issues like uncertainty and probabilities in a way that's meaningful for and respectful towards those we are talking to? And how do we ensure that we're inclusive of local and contextual evidence? It promises already to be an extremely interesting session. The first minute was very surprising and excellent, so thank you, Lara. And I'm looking forward to the unfolding conversation, and I think we're probably a lot more relaxed now as a consequence. And I know that I will learn a lot. So I will pass over to Lara to introduce the panelists.
So we are joined today by a very special panel, and I'm so happy that you all have a chance to hear what we heard in our preparing meetings. So first of all, we'll hear from Sarah Viehbeck. Sarah is the Chief Science Officer of the Public Health Agency of Canada. And thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. We appreciate your busy schedule, but we are very happy to hear from you today. Then we'll hear from Mark Schneider, the Director of the Institute of Education Sciences and Department of Education. Thank you so much, Mark, also for joining us today. And finally, from my dear friend, Bruce Stewart, the founding chair of the Africa Evidence Network, that will also be a great puzzle of minds here for us to finish this amazing day. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Sarah to speak.
Thanks very much to you all for the invitation. Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure to be joining you on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples here in Ottawa. It's my home, and I continue to learn about the origins of both the territory and also the people that were first here and how they contributed to the creation of our community. I am a government official. I operate in a world of briefing notes and slide decks. The briefing note said nothing about the facial exercises, but I love it. And I am going to use a few slides to help keep me on track for my remarks today. I want to thank you for the kind invitation, and I really welcome the world to Ottawa. I'll start by saying that the COVID-19 pandemic presented an urgent and ongoing need for science integration for decision-making. That will not surprise anyone in this room. All components of the evidence pipeline, from new research, collaborations, mechanisms to synthesize and mobilize evidence, and processes to use science in decisions, were scaled and activated to meet those urgent demands. And I would offer in ways that we probably never expected. The crisis certainly spurred innovation. We expect large-scale systems change to really invite and incent innovation to occur. It also presented a number of challenges in terms of the integration of multidisciplinary and conflicting at times evidence, really finding that signal-to-noise ratio and navigating the complex issues of public trust in science, public trust in governments, public trust in public health. And our agency, the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is the country's federal public health agency, we have a number of lessons learned, as you can appreciate, that we are analyzing and interrogating and hopefully applying in real time around how to integrate science. And I'll offer a few remarks to that effect today. So this is a diagram intending to really put together what was a quite complex evidence picture. When I was looking at it again this morning, it occurred to me that it reminded me of Margaret Whitehead's rainbow of social determinants of health. At the center is the evolving science base that really did inform a response. The need to set and reset science priorities, the need to act and respond to evidence as it came out, often in very real time. The combination of supply and demand tensions and complementarities between the pace, pressure, and volume of emerging evidence with the need to take decisions at a huge impact in many cases. This relationship between science and an emergency, of course, was not in and of itself an unexpected one. And in fact, as part of our pandemic preparedness guidance documents, we certainly understood the need to integrate science as a core component to emergency response. Within our pandemic preparedness guidance, that is shared guidance between the federal, provincial, and territorial levels of government in Canada, we saw an articulation of the need to guide pandemic responses based on an overall research strategy that incorporated components related to research prioritization, the activation of research networks, rapid research to actually generate new knowledge, and to engage in knowledge translation strategies, including, importantly, knowledge syntheses. I offer here some data which are nearly a year old. These were pulled in January of 2023 from the Dimensions database, suggesting at the time more than 1.5 million global publications in COVID-19 across all forms of publication, nearly 50,000 of those from Canada. And what I offer to you on the other side of the slide is the important contribution that intramural science, that is science conducted in government, made to that global evidence base alongside considerable response activities by government. I pulled that out because I think it really shows and demonstrates the interdepartmental and intersectoral nature of the response to COVID-19 and of the evidence base that we were trying to integrate and synthesize, and that we needed some help in doing so. So how did we approach the synthesis of evidence? Well, we did so in partnership with a number of actors, both within the public health agency, but also outside of our walls in terms of extramural science, based in academia, based in networks of evidence synthesis groups like COVID End, based in centers like the Public Health Agency has funded around the National Collaborating Centers for Public Health, who play an important leadership role in synthesizing evidence and data across a variety of fields. We bolstered our internal capacity to both identify and help to prioritize evidence synthesis needs, ensure that the questions were framed in an appropriate way, and that they could be activated out through that partnered system that I described in order to be responded to. With over 390 rapid and living evidence products generated across this system, what this tells you, I think, is that we sought synthesis support for, and integrated and considered this evidence in our decision making. This room will not be at all unfamiliar with the significant shifts in how science is done. We saw acceleration of some of these shifts through the COVID pandemic, and certainly these shifts, I think, really bring to bear for us as we set our forward strategic agenda, how we will actually position ourselves as a National Public Health Institute in science. So what did we learn? And I'll go through these very quickly because there will be time for this in discussion. We learned that we really needed mechanisms, ideally standing mechanisms, to make evidence when it existed, to actually analyze and consider what synthesized knowledge meant for our decision-making processes. We learned that we needed to do that in a way that also had expert advice feeding in when there was an absence of evidence to actually inform decision-making. We're pursuing rostering of expertise so that we're more ready to activate those networks in the future. We're considering how we structure our scientific advisory bodies, and we are aiming toward methods that are much more formalized and institutionalized, hardwire those connections for expert advice into decision-making. We learned a whole lot about public trust, and I can speak more about that in the discussion section. Certainly as a government agency in a field that has never, I don't think, had such a spotlight shone on it, we learned a lot about how to build, maintain public trust, and how to do that in collaboration with communities and community leadership. And we also learned a tremendous amount about the importance of considering and integrating equity considerations from the outset. And this was recognized at the earliest stages of our pandemic, but certainly has been an ongoing reminder in terms of the importance of that for our forward agenda. We've applied some of these lessons to other emergency responses. In addition to COVID-19, in the last year, the agency has responded to 5 other public health or other emergencies. And I'll give one example here around Mpox, which is a condition endemic in many countries, but became a public health emergency of international concern last year. We took a much more purposeful and integrated approach to bridge together expert knowledge, evidence support structures, developing a shared science and research plan through clear science priorities, and linking that up with our federal research councils in order to support the funding of new research to respond to those priorities. So what does this mean for the future? I believe that it means as we consider our preparedness agenda, we need to not only think about emergency preparedness, but science and research preparedness for emergencies. That needs to be a fully integrated part of emergency preparedness, including the core capacities, established relationships and networks to be able to activate more quickly. We need to continue to assess and build capacity in the broad evidence support system, including expansion of the scope beyond emergency considerations for other emerging and present public health issues, including chronic disease prevention. We need to establish stronger networks intra and extramurally and determine where we can best contribute intramurally, where we need help, and where some things are best undertaken extramurally. And lastly, we need far more sophisticated frameworks for science integration across the life course of an emergency. I'll look forward to continuing the discussion with you and talking a bit about our forward science strategy as part of the discussion period. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We'll have the opportunity for some audience questions in the end. So I'll pass now to Mark.
Excuse me. I'm Mark Schneider. I'm the director of the Institute of Education Sciences, which is a nonpartisan agency, science agency housed in the U.S. Department of Education. So the fact that we're a science agency sitting in the middle of a mission agency colors a lot of the kinds of thinking and the kind of work that we support. I'm not sure if I have any specific lessons from COVID to share, but I think that the kinds of lessons that we were learning, the kinds of challenges that we faced under COVID actually are much more systemic and much broader than just COVID. So I'm going to talk about some things that are sort of COVID related. I'm going to talk about lessons we've learned over the past few years that have to do with the dissemination of knowledge and also the generation of knowledge. So this morning, people were talking about syntheses of data, and then they say, well, there's not a lot of data to synthesize. So what we also have to be concerned about is the rate of the production of knowledge and then how we ultimately use it. So that's in the background. So I have about 6 or 7 points that I want to cover. So the first and most important lesson is the lesson of audience. So who are you talking to? What's the goal of the work and who are you trying to affect? So if you can't get that straight, if you don't know what the audience is, then you're in trouble, because the nature of the documents that you produce, the briefings, all of this has to be, that's all affected by who you're trying to influence and who you're talking to. So we're a large education science agency. We're nothing compared to the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation, but we're one of the largest investors in education research actually in the world. So one of the first things we did, because we're concerned about audiences, we brought in McKinsey to help us identify the audiences that we are talking to. So they did an audience segmentation analysis, very McKinsey speak. They identified 14 possible audiences for us to address our work to. And then they just, and the list was long: parents, teachers, students, policymakers, state education agencies, et cetera. And then they listed all the across those 14 categories, who do we talk to? And who are we most likely to get traction with? So the group the audience that we are the most successful with are academics, academic researchers. And the reason is that we give out hundreds of millions of dollars a year to them. So they love us. They absolutely love us. So we try to figure out how better to expand to state agencies, for example, or districts. So in the United States, there are 16,000 school districts. There are obviously 50 states, the District of Columbia, and some outlying territories. And we just like, how do we talk to these people? How do we get the information that we are generating into the hands of people who need that information? So we've been working on this for a long time, and years now, and not very successful. So we thought we've been dealing a lot with teachers. There's 2 big teacher unions, and we're trying to figure out how to influence practices on the ground. And teachers in the United States, they do something called teachers pay teachers. So if I'm a teacher and I want to know like a lesson plan about how to take evidence and how to take, to communicate with students, I don't go to IES. I go to teachers pay teachers, and I ask my fellow teachers like, hey, what are you doing with regard to, some historical event? And they pay not a lot of money, but that's how information gets disseminated among teachers. That if in our world, if we're trying to change facts on the ground, that is a serious challenge to how to get into that. Instagram is another place where teachers go. So then we try to figure out how best to talk to policymakers, right? Which in some ways is a major target. And we discovered that there was an incredible high level of frustration with IES and the pace of education research. So it all came down to a single word: timeliness. How timely is the information that you're providing us? And COVID, of course, made that so crystal clear. They said, we have a crisis. What can you do? What can you tell us that could help us ameliorate this disaster that's unfolding in front of our eyes? And we said, well, actually, not much, but give us 5 years and we'll tell you. Right? And like, okay. And then I said, that's not acceptable. So we tried to push harder and harder to get shorter term projects that are rigorous and high quality. And like the machine that we built a giant machine in the United States education research machine with billions of dollars. And like, oh yeah, we don't do that. Well, I mean, if I give you 5 years to do this study, by the time your study is done, the COVID will be gone. And what will you be telling us? And well, that's not our job. Our job is to take your money and do a 5-year study, right? And incredible level of frustration. So in the authorizing legislation for IES, which is up for renewal, if you're following any of the news in the United States, you know that the Congress, the odds of them passing legislation is very low. But in the reauthorization, the word timeliness shows up in every other sentence. So we need to focus on timeliness. So part of the problem, at least for us, there was a dynamic problem between the fact that most of our work goes to researchers and what's the incentive of researchers? The incentive of researchers is to have a level of accuracy that will get them published in major journals. That's the fact. But we don't live at the 5th decimal point. We live to the left of the decimal point. So if we give money to a researcher who spends 5 years getting to the 5th decimal point, that is not going to work for policymakers. So we had that. The second problem is that we're not allowed by law to lobby for anything in any pending legislation. We could advise and we could talk, but the stricture on lobbying means that our ability to talk to policymakers, to people in the Congress is extremely limited. Another problem that we face is the problem of communications. So we, like many science agencies, we're paying for huge reports, right? And nobody reads them. So we're trying to so one of the things that I tried to do very hard was to say no report coming out of IES would be more than 15 pages. And oh my God, you would think that like, anyway, it was a very difficult sell. And, you know, we pay for this stuff. So we're not going to pay for 80-page, 100-page, 200-page reports, 15-page reports, 4-page left behinds, high infographics, high color, easy bullets and I call them left behinds is because when we go to the Hill to, you know, the Capitol, we don't lobby, but we leave things behind. So then these 4-page things were the goal to affect policymakers. And then we had a much more structured abstract for the 1-pager. We also, so 15 pages, plain English. Here's the style guide for IAS. Short sentences, strong verbs. Incredibly hard to enforce, right? Getting people to write in plain English, short reports. So I'm sure half of you think like, well, wasn't it Mark Twain that said, I didn't have time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one? That's what that's what we have, right? So no, there's a discipline to writing short, concise reports using plain language. And part of like, if we want to communicate with policymakers, those are lessons that we need. We also, so we run the What Works Clearinghouse, right? And the What Works Clearinghouse is one of the granddaddies of all clearinghouses. So it's a problem, and we're trying to figure out how best to fix it. So the joke for a very long time about the What Works Clearinghouse was it was the What Doesn't Work Clearinghouse, right? Because most things don't work, and you know, so we document it doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and then people just get frustrated and they say like, does anything work? And well, sometimes things work, but that's the nature of our business. But we got tagged with the What Doesn't Work or Nothing Works Clearinghouse actually. So then we started trying to figure out a different way of thinking about it. And this is difficult because most education tech, most education products are sold by commercial companies. I have no problem with the private companies, by the way, but many of them don't test anything. They're selling snake oil, but they say, you take our curriculum and 100% guarantee that this is going to work. Okay. So we have in the What Works Clearinghouse, like the standard, as they say, frequentist statistical test of 0.05, which is crazy. I mean, this is 100 years old and was probably stupid 100 years ago and certainly stupid now. But the fact of the matter is, if you get rid of the 0.05, what do you do? And how do you repackage the findings, right? So that it says, this is your best bet, right? This is your best bet. So we say, hey, this thing has a 60% probability of working for students that you have. This thing has a 40%, this has an 80%, right? And in the meantime, you know, somebody from McGraw-Hill comes along and said, 100%, I guarantee this is gonna work. So we have, this is a dynamic problem that I think the What Works Clearinghouses across the nation have, right? And there's the other problem with it is that we should be saying, and this is our mantra, what works for whom under what conditions. So IAS was one of the agencies that pushed the hardest for education research to use RCTs, randomized controlled trials. And the theory of action was that we would base what goes into the What Works Clearinghouse on main effects. Well, that doesn't work, right? Because it's a question of fit. And the main effect is the average over groups, right? And we need to figure out how better to drive the things that work down to the populations that it works for. So something that works for population A probably won't work for population C or population X. So the flaw in the main effects is that everything is conditional. Everything works, not everything, many things work for one student population, not another. And the only way we're going to get that to happen, to understand the fit, is through replications. So Education research doesn't have a replication problem because we hardly ever replicate anything. So the problem with replication, well, first of all, the biggest problem with replication is that most things don't replicate, right? Because for many reasons, right? So the first thing that we try to do with regard to replication was to say, hey, here's something in the What Works Clearinghouse that worked for this population over here. Could have been a couple of hundred students. It could have been 12 years ago, but it's never been replicated. So here's a bunch of money, replicate. So people came back with the exact same model, right? Give us $5 million, give us 5 years, and we'll replicate it. And replication meant it worked in New York. So now we're going to replicate it in Chicago. And give us, again, $5 million in 5 years, and we'll tell you whether or not it replicates in Chicago. Well, I mean, imagine a science that's built on that. So if we had done COVID vaccines that way, everybody would have been dead, right? We would have still been struggling to find a vaccine that works, but that's the model that we had. So we have now invested in, we did an X Prize. We've invested in digital learning platforms for rapid cycle innovation, rapid cycle testing. So not everything can be tested in 6 weeks or 6 months, but many things can be. And what we're trying to do is do rapid cycle experimentation, things that work. Now we replicate again on a rapid cycle to figure out, and each replication is testing it in a different population. So to the extent to which that works, we end up with what works for whom under what conditions. That's a major change in the way in which the science and the testing was done. So one of the things that that was incredibly important to communicate to people is that it is okay to fail. Government bureaucrats hate failure. It doesn't mean they don't fail. It means that when they do fail, which is often, they never talk about it. So we hired some really excellent researchers to go through hundreds of reports that from our grantees, to give us the lessons of why they didn't work. Are there any lessons in these 500 studies that were, most of them were, never published because there's such incredible bias in publications for things that work and things that don't work, and like go through this and tell us what works. And we never got that report. Another failure. So what we're trying to do with the What Works Clearinghouse is to make it more responsive, to use probabilities rather than the 0.05. We're trying to figure out how to increase the external validity components of the What Works Clearinghouse as compared to internal validity, a major problem. So a couple of other points, I'll just list them quickly because they really matter, especially in terms of the generation of evidence and how we build our science. So scaling is an incredibly difficult process, but it's fundamentally important. So our goal is to go from a couple of hundred students in an RCT to a couple of thousand students to a couple of 100,000 to a couple of million students. The problem is that the work on scaling is not that good. The one thing that we know and that we're building into all our work is that if you want something to scale, you have to plan from day one. You can't take a thing that worked, at the end of a 5-year project, a 3-year project, doesn't matter. This work, you cannot create scaling at the end of a project. So you have to think about scaling from day one. A second thing that's fundamentally important is that we have to have a much better discussion with regard to protecting privacy protected information. So in the US, there are incredible fights over student privacy, and I agree 100% that protecting student privacy is essential. But the fact of the matter is there are privacy enhancing technologies that we need to socialize. We need people to understand that the protections of student privacy protections from 10 years ago are out of date. There are new ones that will allow us to merge data sets better while still protecting privacy. The last one has to do, of course, with AI. So we have spent I don't know how many $100 million since ChatGPT, trying to figure out how best to tap into AI. So the one thing that we learned is that LLMs, large language models, are incredibly powerful. ChatGPT is built on it, Bing is built on it, et cetera. But that's not going to work for us. And part of the reason it's not going to work for us, I'm sorry, it could work for us. But the fact of the matter is that once data goes in there, even though the terms of use of that data are changing, so you could negotiate with OpenAI about enterprise models, et cetera. But those models are so big and so expensive and so energy consuming, and they're general purpose AI machines. So what we're discovering, and what we run some competitions on this, I don't know if we're going to call them mid-size language models, small language models, but there are all kinds of models that are now possible that could fit on this. Maybe not this one, but a souped up one. And if you think about building these are purpose-built, right? They're purpose-built. They don't require, OpenAI. They could be run in a local school district, for example, which means that they control the data that goes in and they control the access to the data. That alone will make AI much more palatable to local school districts. And I think that the technology is there, and just watch for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And now let's hear from Ruth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the warm welcome. I hope you're still awake because I have some stories to tell you. I want to start with a story about a family I know who live in Johannesburg. So I'm based in South Africa. And I want to tell you about Pierre and Anne-Marie. They are refugees from conflict in the DRC. And they, like my family and I and many others I know well, were living in Johannesburg when the pandemic hit. They're living in a single room. Anne-Marie is a cleaner in the local hospital. She has a very steady but very small wage. Her husband, Pierre, was working as a security guard in a mall. Security guards in malls in South Africa, by the way, they don't actually get paid. They get tips from shoppers. So his work dried up completely as soon as the lockdowns were announced. He was already vulnerable because he's a foreigner living very informally. He was paying very high rent because when you don't have anything to count as surety, you get charged more in a single room. So when the pandemic hit for him, this was about hunger and threats of eviction and an increased vulnerability. He has 2 young children, sorry, he has 3 now. He had 2 young children at the time the pandemic started. So for him, the pandemic arriving was incredibly scary. Now, if we come back to this room, we need to acknowledge that we are the privileged few, right? We had food when the pandemic hit, we had shelter, and we had information. More information and understanding of the evidence than pretty much anyone else in the world. But we were caught unawares. How embarrassing is that? From our position of privilege, we were not ready for the pandemic, not in our personal lives and certainly not in the evidence world. And that's why I think we really do have to listen to the lessons of what we've learned from this experience and change things. So my story, when the pandemic hit and we started to realize what was going on, I'm really good at looking after other people. So I thought, right, I have to look after my family first. My husband was away with my older children, camping. So I knew they were safe. They had to cut their holiday short and come home. But I went out and bought supplies for my home. I didn't buy alcohol. I didn't anticipate the alcohol ban. I was not forgiven for several years by my husband for not stocking up on alcohol. But I had to organize childcare. I had an 18-month-old, a 5-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old. There was a lot to sort out just for my family. And I know all of you were doing something similar. If nothing else, we were all buying toilet rolls, right? Then we worked on the safety of my team. So I was leading a team of about 25 people, all working in evidence. We had a team meeting, an outside team meeting. And we sent some people home straight away. We had pregnant women on our team and we said, this is not safe. But this wasn't straightforward. And we live in a very privileged city in Africa. And I know a lot of people were not even as privileged as us, but we didn't have laptops. People didn't have data. People didn't have desks. Some people are living in one room homes. So a lot of us worked from our beds for the next so many years. And anybody who thought that you should put a camera on for a meeting doesn't realize that you don't always have an environment that you want to show your boss, even if it's just your bed, right? So we did a lot of running around and organizing for our immediate team. And then our community. So we knew as much as pretty much anyone in the city knew about what was going on. So we printed public health information sheets and I drove around for the next few days. And every time I saw someone begging on the street, shopping in the mall, I was handing out information and telling people they could ask questions because people were terrified as they were around the world, but we did not have good sources of information. I went and gave my telephone number to a whole set of people. The waitress who greeted me every morning with a coffee got my phone number because people were so vulnerable that I needed to know that they could reach out to me if they're in real trouble. And I was not the only person. So a lot of our team were doing similar things. And those numbers over the coming months, I had requests for legal advice, requests for food, for money, for data, all sorts of things. We checked in with our government colleagues. You know, what are you doing? What's happening? Is everyone running around the corridors like crazy, trying to work out what to do? We checked in with our evidence colleagues around the world. So some of you are here and we were busy checking with one another what's happening, what are you being asked for, have you worked out what's going on? We learned from the most surprising corners. So if you want to know what to do when there's a highly infectious condition that nobody really understands, go and talk to the West Africans. They've dealt with Ebola and they know what to do. And really shame on the UK and America because my colleagues in Cameroon could tell us what to do. You close the borders, you wear masks, you all sorts of things. So the teams across Africa were doing extraordinary things and had amazing knowledge. And where we had connections already, we could call each other. So that was kind of my personal story and what happened in that. I think I've just described like 48 hours of activity to you. So what about the evidence world? So I've been working in evidence-informed decision-making for the last 20 years, mostly from Africa and around Africa, but based in South Africa for the last 10. The first thing I want to say is a bit controversial. There wasn't a systematic review that was going to solve our problem anywhere. Systematic reviews were not the answer at that point. There weren't any. There weren't any studies. I never went to the Campbell Library at all during the pandemic. All across our continent, though, information was being shared on WhatsApp. So WhatsApp is the most used social media app across the continent. And I must have had 40 or 50 WhatsApp messages telling me about the pandemic, telling me about sensible solutions, problematic solutions, all sorts of things. So WhatsApp was buzzing. The Cochrane Library and the Campbell Library at that point were a little bit useless. They got better. So we're talking about rapid reviews because that is something that happened. I just want to have a show of hands. How many people here were involved in rapid reviews in some way during that period of time? Okay, so we were all doing rapid reviews probably on the similar subjects. I hope some of us in partnership. We did a lot of rapid reviews. We had to get the evidence together fast for people who needed to make decisions even faster. And we were all scrambling, right? Thank goodness for our networks, because that is where we could tap into a resource of knowledge and while we were in a privileged position. So credit to our strong and long-lasting relationships, especially those that spanned research and knowledge sources and government, because they were, the strong ones were like gold then. And people were mining us, not for the evidence, they were mining us for our relationships to other people. And that was what became the currency that was really valuable when it came to knowledge. And lots of us realized, and I heard you say, Laura, yesterday, lots of us realized quite quickly that other teams were doing the same rapid evidence reviews. of different kinds. And that was hugely helpful. When you could speak to another team, whether it was in Uganda, whether it was in Kenya, wherever you were in the world, if you could find the other team doing the similar-ish rapid review, you could share. And the Africa Evidence Network and the current co-chair Rona is here, or looking after Malika at the moment, I suspect. But they did a great job of just sharing the rapid reviews. And credit to that team in Uganda, because they have a principle of transparency. So if they are creating rapid evidence, they share it. It's there and freely available. And thank goodness, because we were all tapping into that kind of information. Now, I heard yesterday, and I want to acknowledge an excellent point, which was that the mission is important, the institution is not. So actually, I was dismissing Cochrane and Campbell and those great libraries of evidence that didn't have anything to tell us at that point, but credit to those in that group, those groups who came together as COVID end, because through those networks, which John and Jeremy and many of you in this room were able to bring together, we suddenly had more than 50 teams around the world speaking to each other regularly and tapping into what we're doing. So I'm not supposed to be telling you what's wrong. I'm supposed to be giving you some advice on what we should think about next. So we know that there are more crises coming. We cannot pretend that they're a surprise. Climate change is not a surprise. It's coming. So there are things we need to do now so that we can be more ready and we can have those partnerships as you were describing. So the first one I want to say is we need greater humility. We need more collaboration building, and we don't need kingdom building. If you're interested in kingdom building, go and work in another field, please. We need trust. We need trusted partnerships, and we need to trust partnerships. That really is important. The mission is important and not the institution. So those partnerships are not about branding and naming and leading. It's about collaboration, genuine collaboration. And then within those collaborations, we need to think really seriously about equity and in the evidence we generate. Because the truth is the pandemic damaged any small successes we had had in heading towards equity. The world is a much less equal place now. We see it on our streets and we see it across Johannesburg, where I live. We know that there are millions of young girls who will never return to school. You can go on and on. So we need to think about how we can get ready, not just for partnerships, but ready for more equal partnerships and ready for more equal evidence. We need to think about how we plan our networking events, our evidence events. I don't really know why we're traveling. In fact, I think it's fair to say that those of us from low middle income countries come here because if we don't, we're going to miss out. But we don't want to come here. We want you to come to us. Because if you come to us, I can invite my team and my colleagues will be there. And we need to start to tackle, we need to start to use practices that enable people to get visas, because there are things we can do to change the diversity in this room. So we're talking about inequality. This room is inequality and it is making it worse amongst our own community. So we can change how we run events and where we travel. And I'm sure Jeremy will forgive me for saying this. It doesn't matter if Jeremy Grimshaw never goes to another evidence conference in his life. I mean, he's wonderful, but he doesn't need to go. It doesn't change his career to be there, but it will change some of the young researchers on our team and on other teams across low middle income countries if they get to be at these events. So let's not come here anymore. I love Canada. Thank you for welcoming us. Everyone's talking about not duplicating efforts. Like, let's make that count. We need to stop producing shiny methodological products. We need to start thinking about who needs evidence, what about, and provide it for them. The shiny methodological stuff, that's like geeky world. Same thing, go work for someone else in another field, please. What else? Okay, I'm gonna come to an end now, sorry. So, thank you to everybody who collaborated and made evidence more available. It did provide solutions. We did get there, and we got there amazingly fast, and we got there on very few resources and a lot of free hours and late nights. So thank you, because that was in part credit to many of you here. So let me just take you back to Pierre, Anne-Marie, and their family. They survived the pandemic, and that's no small thing. There were a lot of funerals, a lot of funerals. Anne-Marie was wearing a mask in her job cleaning the wards in the hospital long before it became law, because she knew somebody who knew about the evidence about masks, networks. They had their vaccines because they knew that there were places they could go to ask questions, people they could go to, not places, people they could go to ask questions about vaccines and about masks. They got support from their church, and their church got to meet outdoors where it was safer because they could tap into advice on how to meet in those kind of settings. And those social support systems were really important. They found somewhere new to live. Pierre has a new job, and they have a new baby, and they're really well. And they did okay, not because of a systematic review. They did okay because they had social networks, and they had social networks with people who knew about evidence. And because of that, they survived the pandemic, and so did we. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our speakers. Very inspiring. And some of the questions that Laura and myself have for you before we open it up to the audience, you've actually covered quite a lot of that, especially in regards to equity. And so one of the things I want to ask each of you is whose knowledge and what type of evidence was considered more legitimate in your context? And I'm going to ask if you can be relatively brief. That's not pointed at you, Mark, in any way, but would you like to take that with this one?
So the US is, as you know, a continental sized country, 330 million people, a very complicated system of education. So what works in Massachusetts doesn't work in Mississippi. What works in California doesn't work in North Carolina. So there's no simple answer to the question. And again, I think this goes to the point about what works for whom under what conditions. We have to be much more sensitive to the communities that we're talking to, the communities that we're serving, the different states. Again, it's just it's not a simple answer. It's an incredibly complicated answer. If it was simple, we would have done it already.
Sarah, and same to you. Was there kind of hierarchies in terms of the evidence that you were being presented with or seeking or able to find?
Thanks very much for the question, and a privilege to listen, Mark and Ruth, to both of you. I'll reflect on this kind of in the same way that Mark did. I don't think that, there certainly was no formal hierarchy. I will say that as I reflected in my remarks, the integration work, I think, was really, really imperative. So what did we draw on a sometimes daily, definitely every few days basis? Combination of our surveillance data around hospitalizations, around case numbers, around outcomes. We drew on the modeling data to understand what was currently happening and where things were going in the future. We drew on data around vaccines and other medical countermeasures and looked at those in relation to each other. We looked at data around public health, non-pharmaceutical interventions, because we knew that there would be needing to be layers of protection. And so how do we integrate all of those pieces together? And then evidence from reviews was extremely helpful so that we weren't looking at data on a single study, although there were times when in areas there was only one single study to look at, but situating those findings in relation to bodies of knowledge. And we also paid a lot of attention to what those data meant, not only in relation to each other, but for particular communities. And I think as the pandemic went on, as equity issues really emerged as an area in need of attention, not just across socioeconomic groups, but also across the life course. The impacts on children, the impacts on older adults in our story in Canada, on older adults, and particularly those living in long-term care settings, was not not good, to say the least. And so I think that as the pandemic wore on, it was the integration of evidence across multiple sources and the integration, the understanding of what that evidence meant across different populations and segments.
Thank you. So within South Africa, there was some really good evidence, and we have some great networks with some government colleagues who were commissioning rapid reviews and paying attention to them. And I think in many cases, they made some good policies. But if you actually ask what was influencing most people in South Africa at the time, it was the well-worded WhatsApp messages that sounded, some of them were rubbish, but the more confident they were written, the more it said senior doctor from China or from the US, or the Canadian physician has discovered, and could present that convincingly in a soundbite, preferably with a picture. We had, I'm sure you did too, we had recorded messages of a doctor speaking, telling people that this is the remedy, and everyone's forwarding it saying, pay attention. So whilst we are reassured that our government colleagues who are great engagers with evidence, the truth is random WhatsApp messages that were largely misinformation was definitely the dominant information source for most of the population. That's a bit scary.
So in the interest of time, I would like to jump to the audience and check whether we have any questions, comments, facial reactions. Peter, please.
Hi, Peter Bragg from Monash University, Australia. Thanks for a great series of talks. And Ruth, thanks for reminding us of our privilege as well. I'd like to say something about journals and collaboration, because I think it's a bit of an elephant in the room. Yeah, when you think about the performance metrics of universities and the journal publishing models, we're actually incentivized not to collaborate, which is the opposite of what we should be doing. And I'm not sure how we're going to solve this problem, but just to give you a simple example, when you register, I know Prospero basically collapsed during the pandemic, but when you register a review, you're encouraged to look to make sure that it's not being replicated, but you're not encouraged to join another review team. So how are we going to build these networks that worked informally so that we can do better? And then there's two other questions. The question to universities is, when are they going to change their metrics so that you don't advance by being the first author on a publication, which is effectively a license to replicate, not to collaborate? And this is a question I really don't know the answer to, but all the paywalls that went down for COVID, are they going to go back up again? And when?
Any other comments? Yes.
So, I think part of.
So I want to thank Ruth for an excellent story. And I just want to comment, not a question. Tamara, are you in the room? Where's Tamara? So during that time, I reached out to Tamara. I was teaching a class of about 50 students, 40 students on global health. And I was talking about the pandemic, and I was like, who am I going to reach out to come and talk to my class? And these were senior public health students who were about to graduate. And I invited Tamara to come and speak to my class about this. And it was because several years ago, I met Tamara in London, courtesy of Peter Tugwell. And so the network, as you've pointed out, is so important. And even though you've said it doesn't matter if we go somewhere where Jeremy can be, I think people like Jeremy is important because they make these connections between us younger folks, and we are able to pull on each other. So I just want to say that the power of networking is so important in responding to the unknown, because you might not know something, but somebody else does. And so this is just credit to Tamara, credit to Jeremy, credit to Peter for that network that they helped to create that I was able to lean on in the time of the pandemic.
Are you coming to the mic? Yay.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you for your presentation and your insights. I had a question around misinformation, right? And that's something that you pointed out. I know of people who are who have access to information. They have money, they have a smartphone, they have WhatsApp messaging, but they are also prone to falling victim of misinformation. I know of family members at that time who told me, hey, you know, we need to wash everything. Yeah, all the services, and they were washing money. So, so I'm just wondering about like what role do we have, right? Because we see the value of scientific evidence. We also see the value of sort of translating it in a way that people can understand, but then how do you make them value that versus something else?
Maybe a bit of a challenge on whether we got the balance right with synthesis in making sure that people were contextualizing the findings and weren't actually rolling out inappropriate policies because they wanted a universal solution. And so you're putting things into countries or communities where that was not really an appropriate proposal.
Lovely. So Mark, do you want to start answering some or of these questions?
Well, I mean, there was 3 questions ago, or 4 questions. So look, I mean, we're a major funding agency, and there are many funding agencies. Universities exist to, and faculty respond to incentives. So the answer to your problem is to have funding agencies change the formula and the way in which they give money. So we've been doing this for, I've been in office for 5.5 years. So we require people to do a dissemination plan, okay? And it used to be just like check the box, you published in a scholarly journal, you gave a talk in a scholarly convention. And that was number 1 and number 2 on a list of about 6 or 7, right? And we just put that at the bottom of the list. So we just changed the incentives for how you disseminate information. So it's like, instead of giving a talk to the American Education Research Association, give a talk to a teacher organization, or give a talk to a policy organization, or give a talk at a National Governors Association. So, and all of a sudden, guess what happened? People started giving talks at the NGA rather than the AERA. So the question is really, how do you develop an incentive structure, right? So that academics who work in a very conservative, very traditional, right? So we're putting money on the street for replications because, as you said earlier, people don't get rewarded for replications. You have a slightly different definition of replication than I have, but the fact of the matter is, like, we need to encourage people to replicate studies, because otherwise we have these, I mean, you all know about the replication crisis, but we need to do this, and we need to incentivize people to do it. So I think the question is, how do you get funding agencies in your country to do different, to incentivize academics to do different things, because they want the money, they need the money, and they respond to incentives.
I'll offer a few reflections. The first is that I think your question is really grounded in culture change. And I don't think that's the responsibility of any one organization. I think it's a responsibility and question for the system. And I think that I spent 12 years of my career working at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, which is our national health research funding agency in the country. And I applaud them for opening a conversation through their strategic plan and follow-up around what research excellence means. And I think that's really at the heart of your question. And I think that they're well positioned to lead that conversation domestically. They are a funder, and they, of course, can shape the systems in which science is done. But I think they're also well positioned because they're publicly funded. And public investment in science is often expected to have some form of public benefit. And that doesn't necessarily mean immediate application. There's a whole spectrum of benefit along the evidence pipeline. But I think that when you are publicly linked to organization, there's a connection there. They signed the Declaration on Research Assessment, the DORA statement, which I think is really trying to stimulate a global conversation. And the signatories there are highly varied, from individuals through to academic institutions through to research funders. And I think it's that connection across the spectrum that can really help. Within the Public Health Agency, we have scientists who are also evaluated for their career progression along metrics like research and development activities, like representation and client service, like management of research. It's not exactly like a tenure and promotion process, but a lot of the metrics are similar. And we're looking at ways that we can use our science policy levers around things like open science, around dissemination of outputs, to create a more hospitable environment that incents the kind of contribution that you're speaking about. And so I wouldn't say it's only an academic issue. We experience that also with intramural science. I wouldn't say it's a single organization issue. I think it's a system one. But I think that I've been listening to a version of this conversation for more than 20 years, and I'm more optimistic now than I've ever been around the readiness for shifts. And as I said in my remarks, I think COVID has accelerated some of those shifts based on the kind of contribution that science has made.
So the first thing I'd say is we'll invite Jeremy to Johannesburg any day. But I appreciate what you're saying. And many of us have benefited from extraordinary colleagues who have put effort into introducing us as young researchers to one another. But we're quite good at making networks amongst ourselves as well. On the publications one, I think big ships turn very, very slowly. And actually, I would be saying to all of us that we should have courage and ignore the incentive structures and write papers and collaborate together. And I know it's really hard because then other people are going to get promoted and we're not, etc. But the truth is that we already work in this weird no man's land when people don't value what we're doing anyway. So I would, it's true, right? We're not traditional track academics. So yeah, be brave. Other people are being brave in conflict zones. We can be brave when it comes to who we publish with and how we collaborate. I do think the living synthesis movement of trying to build single evidence bases through collaboration is going to test this in ways we haven't been tested before. So let's try. There was a fantastic question about WhatsApp and communication. And so we actually, one of the things we did with Africa Check, I don't know if Will's here, but the fact-checking community were doing some great work. And we were asked to help them to review the evidence around how to counter misinformation shared on WhatsApp. One of the most interesting findings was that when people share information on WhatsApp, they share it, they believe it's true, but so whether it's true or not, they share it with the people they care about because they want them to be okay. So the people who were sending me messages about washing or, drinking gallons of lemon water or whatever it was, they cared about me. They weren't sharing it for no sake at all. So they are also working within networks of people they trust and care about. But somewhere we have to work with the fact checkers better. And I hope very much that Will bring to Campbell a new relationship that will enable us to learn from what he's been doing in full fact. And then there was a very last question about synthesis and policies where maybe synthesis led to policy decisions that weren't the right ones. And I think maybe in some parts of the world, closing schools is going to, in the long run, quite clearly have been the wrong decision, particularly in environments where my kids go to school where they spend 80% of their day outdoors. It's warm and they would have had open air, because the impact on our children's education around the world, on those girls who will never go to school again, like that's heartbreaking. And of course, deaths due to COVID is heartbreaking too, but I'm not sure that was the right decision. I don't think it was really based on a systematic review. I don't think there was that kind of evidence. So I think I think what it really is that if the UK does something or Canada or the US does something, the rest of the world is under a lot of pressure to follow in that kind of scenario of crisis. And so maybe there is something about that humility and respect and allowing nations to make choices and policies for themselves. Because in that environment, there was a lot of pressure and I'm not sure it was always right. But, you know, hindsight's an amazing thing. And I think decision makers all around the world were, on the whole, doing an extraordinary job under enormous pressure. And if we manage to get some evidence in there, it's mostly credit to their hard work and not really that much down to us. Our challenge now is to acknowledge that we didn't do a great job and we need to build those bits in place so that we do a better job next time and so that we're ready. The networking which allowed someone to phone tomorrow, et cetera, that's about getting ready and being better while we do so that we are more ready.
That's lovely. So we are almost ending this beautiful round of discussion here. And for final words, I would just like to ask you a trick question. So if a new pandemic, worse pandemic started tomorrow, what would be the first thing you would do?
Buy alcohol. Me too.
The perfect ending. Don't ruin it.
They told us not to ruin, so let's buy alcohol, people.
No, we have to end on a slightly serious note, right? I will say, what are we doing? We aren't going to leave it up to leave it up to chance. The preparedness agenda is very alive within the agency, and I think that's the number one piece. And my mission is to ensure a core science component to our preparedness, so that we are scientifically prepared. That includes networks that are well activated, experts that are appropriately identified, and having the evidence supports in place to ensure that our pandemic response is with a science preparedness lens associated with it.
So I will have to add something, of course. So one of the things, so I'm going to talk about education, obviously. One of the things that we discovered during the pandemic is that we had no information whatsoever about what was going on in schools and communities. And to gear up to find that information, we took months, and the information was obviously, as they say, you know, a day late, $1 short. So one of the messages that we've been pushing is the following. So if you build a bridge these days, you're embedding sensors in that bridge, right? So there's smart bridges, right? So they tell you the flow of traffic, they tell you the condition of the concrete, they tell you the condition of the steel. And that's because sensors are being embedded in all of the in all the materials. Material science has gotten incredibly good about sensors and, again, measuring passively the kind of information that is needed to measure the integrity of a bridge. So we have no sensors in schools. So we have one study that we launched as a result of COVID that is called the School Pulse Survey, where we have a representative sample of schools and we survey them on a monthly basis. And it has to do with evolving conditions in the schools. So we started this about 3 months, 4 months after COVID. And the questions at that time were, are you open or are you closed? Are you doing remote instruction? Are you doing hybrid instruction? Are you doing in-person instruction? Are you doing nothing? And that became a model. And I'm sorry, one other thing that was incredibly important was that in comparison to most of our work, we took months, most of our work take a year or two to publish, to get the data set done and publish it. So these are all the pulse is done within 3 or 4 weeks. So we need to think more about sensors in schools that could measure real-time changes faster than the traditional things that we've had. So the other thing that we are doing is someone this morning was talking about the Evidence Act in the US. And one of the things that the Evidence Act requires, except implementing is extremely difficult, is merging of data sets that different federal agencies have. And it's replicated a lot in states also. So the purpose of having these integrated data sets is so that in many of the items in the data set look like something like health information. It's reported on a regular routine basis that could be aggregated. And we work with the CDC to try to figure out how they were measuring COVID responses in schools. They looked to us because we're the experts in schools. We look to them because they're the experts on how to measure things in a real-time basis. But as we move toward integrating administrative data sets, and this is at the federal level and in individual states, the image that we're working is that we can in fact get closer to real-time information about changing conditions. And I'm going to talk about schools, but obviously the goal is much greater than schools. But what we're trying to do is reduce the lag time between things that change in the communities, in schools, in education, and reduce the time that those things are changing in the real world and we're able to measure and report on it.
Mine's very short, apart from buying alcohol. We have a chance to network here now. And that's what I think we should be doing. So if you haven't found someone's phone number, connected with someone, you've got like 24 hours left of this event. And this is your chance to start to build the connections that might allow you to phone that person to offer help or to ask for help.
Yes, no problem. Oh. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers and a very enriching session. I hope you agree. Feels a little bit like the hotel's being dismantled around us. So save yourself. It's just been lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again to our speakers and have a lovely night.